Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to today's The Hindu Newspaper Analysis, where in this session we shall be analyzing the important articles which have appeared in the Delhi edition of the Hindu Newspaper for 26th of July 2023, and we shall be analyzing in depth what these articles basically tell us about. And we shall also be extracting meaningful information and bits of information which are important also for your examination, both for your prelims as well as for your mains examination. At the end of the discussion, we shall also be discussing two subjective type questions and how to create answers for those questions to achieve maximum amount of marks. So let us take a look at the topics that we shall be discussing. So today in total we are going to be discussing around 6 topics. The first topic is going to be drawn from the gig workers struggle hewn in Rajasthan. This is about the new act which has been passed by the Rajasthan Assembly, where it seeks to address the issues faced by the gig workers. And here we shall also be analyzing the pros and the cons of the gig economy in general. So this is something which is relevant for your GS paper 3. And it has appeared in the page of the editorial section. Then after that, moving away from the take-make-dispose model, this is about the circular economy and how India, being the president of the G20 forum as of now, how is it that India is encouraging and what is it that India can do in order to encourage a greater amount of reuse, recycling, and thereby reducing the amount of wastage. So this is also going to be relevant for your GS paper 3. Then after that, there has been a detailed section where the article has talked in depth about the Himachal floods, that whether it is a man-made disaster or purely an outcome of climate change. So that again we are going to analyze that why is it the scenario that we witnessed in the case of Himachal, where you had large-scale rampant destruction happening, why did that happen? What were the causes behind that? And with that, we shall also be analyzing few of the important parameters, such as what do we understand when we talk about the different types of infrastructure building, what do we understand when we talk about the run of the river hydroelectric projects, etc. And this is again going to be relevant for your GS3. It can also be relevant for your GS paper 1, because you do get questions in GS paper 1 as well about excess and extraordinary amount of flooding received in the Himalayan states in particular. Then after that, there is a concept about the full reserve banking which has been expressed in great detail. So we shall be understanding what do we understand or what do we mean by full reserve banking, what do we mean by the fractional reserve banking, what are the implications of each of them. So that is something that we are going to analyze, again relevant for your GS paper 3. Then two of the articles we shall be analyzing briefly for your prelims perspective. One of them is that Lok Sabha passed the biodiversity bill, the amendment to the biodiversity bill. The biodiversity bill, which was first of all passed in 2002, there has been an amendment brought into the same. So that is something which is relevant for your prelims, and also if you have to extract the mains perspective out of it, that will be relevant again for your GS paper 3. Then final orbit raising maneuver of Chandrayaan 3 has been completed. So what is this orbit raising maneuver? How is it that eventually Chandrayaan 3 is going to be injected into the lunar orbit? That is something that we are going to look into it very briefly. So without further ado, let us initiate the discussion with the first topic. So the first topic is drawn from the gig workers struggle hewn in Rajasthan. Now here, this particular article has been written keeping in mind the recently passed Rajasthan Platform-Based Gig Workers Act 2023. Now here, this article talks in detail about the issues faced by the gig workers in general. Now, you would have heard about the term gig workers, gig economy, endless amount of times during your preparation journey. So when you talk about gig worker or in general gig economy, so what is this actually meaning and what is the meaning or the implication of it? So when we talk about gig, so it is a term which has been derived generally from musical performances, generally ascribing to jazz performers, where they would perform for a small amount of time and they would refer to it as a gig. So it would always represent a kind of a freelance, a kind of a temporary performance of sorts. But when you implement it on a larger scale at an economic model, what is the meaning of that gig economy? So in simple terms, the terms that we can understand and relate to very easily, when we talk about any of the, let's say, app or platform based applications such as Uber, Ola, Swiggy, Zomato, etc., any of them, whereby you are using a platform, you are using an app, and there are people who will be working and who will be delivering services to you on a freelance basis, on a temporary basis, and they are not full-time employers of any of these companies. They are referred to as gig workers. So if I talk about the formal definition of it, that what do we mean by gig economy? Only for your reference to be written in the examination. So it is a kind of a labor market that relies heavily on temporary and part-time positions filled by independent contractors and freelancers rather than full-time permanent employees. Now here freelancers and part-time contractors. So basically, let's suppose I have a company A, or let's assume any of them such as Uber, Airbnb, Ola, any of them. Now, Uber will have certain set of employees on its own who will be working on the app, on the developmental parameters, on the service of that Uber in the entirety of the platform and so on. But then when you talk about the drivers and the riders who generally carry you from place to place, they are not full-time employees of Uber. They are basically generally part-time employees, or generally they are freelancers. Now what do we mean when we talk about the term freelancers? So these are the ones who can work in any particular area or any particular sector of the economy on a limited time basis, not on a full-time employment basis. So when Uber, you actually use the app and you get the service of the drivers. Now these drivers are not considered to be an employee of Uber. So as a result of that, they are denied of the benefits that any full-time employee gets. Now Uber treats them as their partners, so to say. So that is where it is referred to as a gig worker. These are referred to as the gig workers. Now India as an emerging market, India as a market where internet penetration is increasing with every passing day, the possibility, the scope for this gig employment is also increasing quite significantly. And by the way, this gig working or the gig economy is not only serving these ride-hailing apps or these food service or food delivery apps, etc. Freelancing can also be done by white-collar employees. White-collar employees such as those who work as, let's say, part-time workers in any particular firm, as any particular contractors and so on. And even when you talk about, let's say, gold-collar employees, for example, you consider professionals such as doctors, professionals such as advocates, lawyers, etc. When they are also working part-time in one firm and then part-time in another firm, they are not associated as an employee of a particular firm. So they can also act as a gig worker, as a gig employee. So that is what constitutes the entirety of the gig economy. In India, Niti Aayog has actually predicted that by the next 5 years, India is going to witness close to around 23.5 million gig workers. So just imagine the scale. So by the year 2029 to 2030, India is going to have close to around 23.5 million gig workers. So in these conditions, or in this scenario, the conditionality, the working conditions and the benefits associated with an employee, that is very, very relevant, because in majority of the circumstances you would have also observed from your personal experiences that these gig workers are not taken care of. And when we say taken care of, in terms of their service benefits, in terms of, let's say, the maternity benefits, the medical benefits, the working hours need to be regulated. So there are various issues that they end up facing. So first of all, let us understand what are the drawbacks associated with this gig economy, because there are benefits associated as well. So we shall be talking about the benefits as well. What is the benefit associated? But then, first of all, what are the drawbacks? So first is lack of scheduled work time. Now, any of these gig workers, basically, if you ask them, if you interact with them, you will come upon the realization that they don't have a scheduled working time. Most of us, we have a kind of a working schedule, but they don't have that. They are expected to work overtime 7 days a week without any proper leave. And as a result of that, what happens? Their health takes a toll. And in those circumstances, they basically end up losing their earning days, because there is no provision for any medical leave as well. There is no provision for a scheduled leave which is required as well. So that is why this is one of the major forms where they always allege a basic form of exploitation being met out to them. Then there is no social security. And when we say social security, we mean medical benefits, insurance cover, and also in the case of, let's say, an accidental death. So is there a coverage for that or not? The answer is no. So that is where, being the only earning members in most of the cases of their family, if something happens or an untoward incident happens, thereby the entire family suffers and there is no job security which is associated. Then there is lack of transparency in terms of earnings. Majority of these apps, majority of the ride-hailing services or food delivery apps that you come across. And again, I would come back to the same point that if you ever get a chance to interact with them, and if you ask them about their plight, they will always tell you that they have no foresightedness or they have no clue about whether they are going to earn XYZ amount or ABC amount, because it is completely randomized based upon the software, and the software is basically in charge of giving those drivers their own cut, ensuring profit to the company, ensuring tax compliance and everything. And if you don't meet the conditional requirements set by these apps or these companies, the software is also very well pre-programmed that you will not be getting any earning furthermore. You will not be given any opportunity to earn any more. So that is where it is a significant disadvantage. Another disadvantage associated is the cartelization of the employers. Now, what do we understand when we talk about the term cartelization? This is a term which has emerged from the term cartel, which basically refers to a kind of a grouping. So majority of the employers, any of these platform-based apps that you talk about, majority of them, they end up treating these gig workers more or less in the similar manner. And when the workers, they tend to raise their voice or they tend to protest against any form of exploitation, eventually you will find that all these companies, they actually end up formulating a similar policy and the workers are not left with any kind of a choice. It is not as if they would leave this particular organization and they would start freelancing work for another organization. That possibility does not exist because all of them, they operate with a similar modus operandi. Then this entire setup of gig workers, it is slightly biased against women, because women labor force participation is a very important factor when it comes to economic growth and economic realization of the potential of any particular region or a country. But whenever you talk about any of these gig workers or gig opportunities, the women the women employees, they don't get the equal pedestal or the equal platform, and in many of the cases they are not even preferred by the employers. So these are some of the drawbacks. If these are the drawbacks, why is it still followed? So obviously there are certain benefits associated with gig working as well. What are the benefits associated? And here you will find that the benefits basically they range both from the aspect of the employers as well as from the view of the employees. And you have to understand that for any topic, for civil services preparation, you have to be objective enough to look at both sides of the coin. You cannot be carried away only by one side of the argument. So what is the other side of the argument which these employers or these companies are putting forward? First benefit is ease of employment. Now what do we mean by that? Ease of employment. Basically, if you go to any particular company or organization to seek a job, to seek some work, there are a lot of various different nuances involved, lot of various criteria involved, where majority of the people, they are unable to satisfy them. And as a consequence, they are left with no employment. And that is one of the reasons about the burgeoning unemployment across the globe, not only in India, but across the globe. Now, the ability or the possibility to be working part-time or as a freelancer in an organization, for that the organization also has got a very limited amount of risk that it carries. Because of easy hire and fire possibilities, there is also a limited risk. So the employers, they are ready to hire as many people as possible. So many people find some or the other meaningful scope of employment generation and income generation. Then, other than that, internet penetration and the possibilities that it holds. Now, India is a country where we have hundreds of millions of smartphone users, and the internet penetration per capita in our country is one of the highest amongst the entirety of the world. So that is where you have to understand that with every region getting connected with internet, there is an increased possibility of gig employment being generated in decentralized areas. And what do we mean by that? That employment opportunities are no longer restricted to the metropolitan cities or tier 1 cities of the country. Even in smaller cities, you will find people with a kind of a small qualification or even some amount of inadequate qualification, they are also getting the ability to earn something. They are also getting the ability to run their household, and that is quite significant. So that leads to a kind of a job opportunity in a decentralized manner, which is very important for the development of demand and the surge of demand and the surge of the economic growth in these smaller towns and smaller suburbs of the entirety of the country. Because one of the reasons when you talk about the rising unemployment is that majority of the job opportunities are restricted into the metropolitan areas. And what that leads to is people would be migrating to the metropolitan areas, increasing the population burden in the metropolitan areas, and at the same time causing multiple issues there as well. And there also, it is not as if once you reach the metropolitan area, you will get a good job. So there also the amount of pay is not very lucrative. So that is where it offers a kind of a ray of hope. So these are few of the benefits associated whereby the economic demand and the economic growth significantly surges forward. Economic growth. Now in India, for a long period of time, that is for the past 5 to 6 years, you would have noticed that there have been sporadic protests coming around from one region or the another, talking about the importance of taking care of these gig workers. And here, the article has basically taken the example of the Hamal model. Now, what is a Hamal or who is a Hamal? So Hamal basically is a Persian term, and it has been used for those people who would carry, or those laborers who would carry sacks of grain or various different goods on their back, and they would basically carry out the transportation purposes or loading and unloading purposes from the merchants as well as from the various storekeepers. They are referred to as Hamals. Now in Maharashtra, during the 60s, you had a greater amount of exploitation that these Hamals, they basically experienced. And when we talk about exploitation, that basically results in or amounts into non-payment of wages, no caring of the social security parameters, no affordable housing, etc. Now in this case, the Maharashtra or the state in itself witnessed a significant amount of unification of these Hamals, and they formed a Hamal Panchayat. Hamal Panchayat. And this was for their own rights. Why? Because it was found out that majority of the employers rather, who would basically provide employment to these hamals, be it the shopkeepers, etc., they would belong to the upper caste, whereas the workers generally would belong to the backward classes, the Dalit sections, etc. So there would be a greater amount of exploitation involved as well. Now, with the help of significant amount of social activists and their role, eventually you had the Mathadi Act, which was passed in 1969. Mathadi Act, which was passed in 1969. Now what this did was, it set up a Mathadi board for the hamals. Now, what these boards would do, so when you have these boards, first of all, they would have or ensure registration of all the workers. So registration of all the workers would be done. Presently, the number of workers who have been registered under the Mathadi board in Maharashtra amounts to close to around 1 lakh. So you can imagine the penetration of this particular board. So registration of workers, registration of the shopkeepers as well. Because that is what the hamals used to, and that is whom the hamals used to serve in general. So registration of shopkeepers. Now, this board would also ensure that on a monthly basis, the wage is something which is paid to them, right? So monthly wage is paid by the shopkeepers. Because what would happen is, because these hamals, they would belong to the depressed sections of the society or the backward classes of the society, many of the times there would be denial of wage payment as well. That I would not give you wage because maybe you have been sick, etc. And in this case, the hamals, they had a kind of a limitation, because understand, human body also has got a limited capacity to do that back-breaking labor work. Eventually, after a certain age, or maybe due to a certain injury or a certain ailment, you might not be able to do that forever. So after a few years, you are left with no work, and eventually they succumb to various illnesses, various issues, and there is no one to take care of their entirety of the family. So that is why ensuring the monthly wage payment was one of the basic things. Other than that, what this board would also do was, they would charge a levy. They would charge a levy for each and every bag carried by the hamals. And this levy would be utilized to provide social security to these workers. So this levy would be used to provide social security. And what do we mean by social security? Here, affordable housing would be provided. Then, health care would also be provided. Then, education would also be provided to the kids. So that is how eventually worker welfare was actually ensured by this Mathadi Act. And it is still prominent today, and still it has ensured a kind of an upliftment in the working conditions, in the social strata of the people working in Maharashtra. Now Rajasthan basically has borrowed from these Mathadi principles, as they are referred to. Now, as per the new act which has been passed, there will be a kind of a platform, and that platform will be the one where all the gig workers have to register on them. Gig workers, they will register on them, and also the companies or the employers, they would also be required to register on that platform. And that platform would maintain the detail regarding how much work a laborer or a particular gig worker has carried out, what are the amount of social security that is accrued to them, what are the conditions which are met out to them. So everything would be registered, and it would be very transparent. Transparency is a key to ensure worker rights, and to ensure rights for any citizen. Transparency is one of the key pointers, and that platform seeks to achieve that. whereby a worker also gets a visibility about what are the benefits associated. Now, in that situation, workers will also be motivated to work or put in the additional effort if required. And also the employers will be bound to pay them the required wage and also the possibility of an overtime wage if required, eventually leading to the upliftment of a large section of the worker population. Eventually, you have to understand that as we move towards that next decade where we have a significant demographic dividend, a lot of people are going to enter into the working age, gig employment and gig economy is going to be one of the key drivers of growth for India in terms of the labor market for the next decade. So in these situations, it is very important for each of the states and at a national and the central level as well to devise these policies which will ensure benefits to each one of them. So in this article till now, what is it that we have covered? We have covered what do we understand by gig economy, who are referred to as gig workers, blue-collared, white-collared employees, and also gold-collared employees. They can also carry out gig employment. What are the benefits associated? What are the drawbacks? What is the Hamal model? What is the Mathadi Act? And also, how is it that the new act passed by Rajasthan is going to help them eventually? Okay? Now, after this, we come to the second article, and the second article is basically about the reuse recycling process. So this is moving away from the take, make, dispose model. This has also appeared in page 6, the editorial section, and this is also going to be relevant for your GS paper 3. Now here, this article talks about the fact that till now, generally the entirety of the world has basically devoted a lot of energy, and the general practice has been to use and throw various different materials. There has not been a factor of sustainability involved in that. So in this case, here, it talks about how there is a need to improve that sustainability and how India, being the president of the G20 forum as of now, how India is helping push forward that particular agenda. So when we talk about sustainability of anything and sustainable development, what is the meaning of that? So sustainable development was highlighted for the first time when? In 1987. It was in 1987 that Brundtland report was furnished. And this Brundtland report talked about sustainable development for the first time. And it talked about the fact that sustainability is the ability to use the resources in a responsible manner in such a way that the resources which are available to us, the same resources will also be available to the future generation. So minimizing the wastage, increasing the efficiency of usage, that is basically sustainability. Now, India being the chair of G20 here, India has set up 4 priority areas to improve that reuse, reduce and recycle. So first is circularity in the steel sector, where steel sector being one of the most energy intensive or most carbon intensive sectors, how is it that circularity can be achieved? And when we talk about circularity here, what is the meaning of circularity? That when you use it, after that, you try to reuse it or recycle it, and then you reuse it, and thereby ensure that the material is kept in circulation. So there will be an economic benefit for the recyclers as well, for the refurbishers as well, and for the manufacturers as well. So the economic growth will happen, whereas the material will not get wasted. So circularity in steel sector is one of those areas. Now, when we talk about circularity in steel sector, why is that relevant? Because the usage of steel is ever going to increase across the globe as the developmental requirements they mount up. And developmental requirements, they are increasing every day. So when we talk about the steel sector in general, steel sector, here you have significant amount of developmental requirement. Okay? Other than that, in the case of the steel sector, it is also significantly carbon intensive. What do we mean by carbon intensive? lot of greenhouse gas emissions are carried out. In fact, if you talk about the amount of carbon emissions in the energy sector alone, close to around 7 to 10% is accounted by the iron and steel sector. Now, the amount of recycling carried out in this sector is very abysmal. There is a reuse and recycling rate of only 15% to 20% of recycle and reuse. Okay, only around 15 to 20% is the prevalent rate. Now, that is abysmally low. And here also you have to understand that when you recycle a scrap metal or a steel, the amount of carbon emitted is much lesser as compared to manufacturing of a new steel. I will repeat this point. When you recycle the existing steel products, the amount of carbon emissions that are carried out are much lower as compared to manufacturing of a new steel. Now, why is that important in the present scenario? Now, I'm sure you would have heard about the fact about net zero emissions, where across the world all the countries are vying for net zero emissions. And what does that mean? That the amount of emissions that has to be reduced, but whatever amount of emissions are being carried out, they are also sequestered at the same time. So there is carbon sequestration of the equal amount. So no net emission. So that is the net zero emissions. So each and every country, particularly the G20 nations, they have fixated their own net zero emission targets and they are working towards that. And for that, they are required to reduce the amount of emissions carried out by various sectors such as iron and steel. A country like India, which is spending trillions of rupees and huge amount of capital in development of infrastructure, be it highways, railways, airports. Now, in that condition, the requirement of steel is ever going to increase. But more than that, you also have to appreciate the fact that a significant chunk of our exports is dominated by iron and steel. Now, we have witnessed last year and also in the earlier part of this year how the European Union has basically come across a mechanism that is CBAM. And what is that? That is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Now, what is this? Now, as per these norms, it is basically the norm has been set, the regulation has been set that any country exporting its product to European Union will be taxed. That product will be taxed significantly in the case where, let's suppose, that country is emitting a lot of carbon while manufacturing the product, not keeping in tune with the EU standards, they will be taxed heavily. So that means Indian steel is going to cost much greater in European nations. So our export is going to be hampered from 2026-27 onwards anyways. So it is anyways very pertinent and important for us to reduce the amount of emissions carried out by this sector. So that is where circularity of the steel sector is very relevant. Then comes the role of EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility. This is another priority area that India has set. Now, Extended Producer Responsibility means what? It basically accounts to that the producer of any item, be it a plastic bottle, be it any mobile phone, etc., e-waste, plastic waste, battery waste, biomedical waste, etc. Now, in these cases, it is the producer's responsibility to ensure not only the proper recycling, but also proper disposal of the waste. Now, in India, you have more than around 2,000 producers, brand owners and importers who have been registered under EPR. And India has also recently carried out the amendments into the e-waste management or the e-waste management bill and also the plastic waste management bill, whereby the EPR conditions have been further strengthened, where there has again been a platform which has been developed whereby all the various different producers, importers, brand owners, they are supposed to be registering on that platform. So overall, so many different types of producers have registered, so many different numbers of importers have registered, that in total it accounts for millions of tons of waste being handled carefully, and the producers have been made responsible for fulfilling that target. And that is relevant across the globe as well. So that is again an idea about the reduce, reuse and recycle. Then circular bioeconomy. And what is the meaning of that? So when we talk about the bioeconomy, the usage of biofuels, for example, that has increased tremendously in these G20 nations in particular. Now, it includes biofuel such as bioethanol, etc. Now here, this is also very much relevant for a country like India, which on a day-to-day basis witnesses large amount of crop residues, very large amount of municipal solid waste as well. So this is generally generated by the crop residues, then municipal solid waste, right, which is generally discarded out there into the open. Now, these have been utilized, or these are being utilized significantly at a greater proportion to provide energy requirements. And for this, the government has basically passed certain amount of legislations and has brought various amount of schemes as well. For example, in a thermal power plant is the one which uses heat generated by, let's say, burning of coal in order to produce electricity. So in these thermal power plants, it has been mandated that 5% of the fuel would be the bio pellets, which have been manufactured by the pelletization of, let's say, the crop residues, which will also provide you significant amount of energy. And all of you must also be aware about the ethanol blending program of the government, whereby the petrol or the fuel mixture that is mixed with ethanol, 20% of ethanol. So these are already few of the government schemes and programs which have been functioning to ensure a circular bioeconomy. Other than that, there has also been the government schemes such as Pradhan Mantri Jeevan Yojana, and this is for the second generation ethanol production. So for example, even when we talk about biofuel, you have various generations of biofuel. First generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation, and so on. So here, this is about the 2G biofuel. Now, this generation of biofuel, that categorization is done depending upon how that production is carried out. So 2G biofuel is basically produced by recycling and reusing the crop residues. And please keep in mind, we are a country who suffers significantly due to burning of crop waste and crop remnants such as stubble burning. Every year, from the month of October onwards, the entire northern part of the country is almost suffocated because of immense amount of crop burning and the residue burning which is carried out. So in that situation, these residues will significantly help to augment even the farm income. Then you have also got the Gobardhan scheme, whereby the various agro waste such as cow dung, which is again left out in the open and disposed of, that is to be recycled and reused for biogas and biomethane production. And that is going to power significant amount of cooking requirements and cleaner cooking requirements of many households. Already you have more than 500 such centers which have been established across the country. And then you also have the Satat scheme, that is the Sustainable Alternative Towards Affordable Transportation scheme, whereby under this scheme, the government has been endeavoring to promote CBG, or basically compressed biogas, as an alternative to the general fuel such as CNG, etc., which is being used. Now this will be environmentally friendly, this will be cheaper as well, it will reduce our import bills. So that is where the circular bioeconomy is going to pan out. Now here there is another aspect, and that is establishing an industry-led resource efficiency and circular economy industry coalition. Even though this phrase is quite long and this is actually a sentence long, but understand the basic meaning of it. And the basic meaning is very simple. that is industry-led. That is something which has been initiated, a coalition, an alliance which has been initiated by the industry themselves, where the government is not a partner, and where there is an adequate information and knowledge sharing happening. For example, when we talk about the recycling, the ability to recycle, let's say, electronic waste. Now, all the countries don't have the capability to recycle with greater efficiency the various amount of waste that is generated. So in those circumstances, there are a lot of inefficiencies in various different countries, due to which the countries, they don't adopt good practices, and that leads to, again, exaggeration of the problem. So this principle basically talks about that amongst the G20 nations, let the industry leaders come together, let them share ideas about how they can go ahead with that circular economy of reuse or reduce, reuse and recycle, and how eventually that will lead to sustainability. So this is what the article is basically about, where it talks about the requirement of sustainability and how to achieve that sustainability, what is the importance of that sustainability, and how India, through its various mechanisms, through its various government programs, has been leading the way even at the time when it is at the chair of the G20. Okay? Now, after that, we come to the next article. And that article is something which has been reiterated quite significant number of times in the recent month and the recent past. So most of you would be aware of that. And that is about Himachal floods, whether it is a man-made disaster. Because nobody can actually contradict that it is a disaster. It is a disaster of humongous proportions. There have been countless number of lives which have been lost in the wake of that sudden amount of downpour and flash floods which have ravaged the entire area. The losses in terms of economic parameters amount to more than around 10,000 crores. Just pause for a moment and digest that figure. That is the amount of loss that Himachal Pradesh has witnessed in a short span of a couple of weeks. So why does this happen? And why is this a reiterating problem? Not only in Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand also suffers from the same. Assam also suffers from the same. Northeastern states, they also suffer from the same issue. All the Himalayan regions, they suffer from the same issue. So why is that created? So here, rather than going into the nitty-gritties of each and every paragraph here, let us broadly cover the contours of this article and let us try to understand that why this disaster keeps on happening year after year. So basically, one of the factor is climate change. Now, climate change here, basically what do we understand by that? That it is the changing climatic conditions. The expected climatic conditions, they are frequently changing. Now, as a consequence of that, what do we have? We have unequal distribution of rainfall. Now, what does that mean? So basically, the amount of rainfall in total, if you calculate, carried out between the months of June, July, August, that amount of rainfall is not varying quite significantly. The general perception would be that we are receiving much more amount of rain, but that is not the case. The total amount of average rainfall remains the same, but then there's a sporadic distribution, in the sense that in one day, let's say you have 5 centimeters of rain, followed by 15 days of dry condition, then followed by another day of 10 centimeter rain, followed by another 15 days of dry condition. Now what that leads to is, whenever you have that sudden amount of rainfall, obviously the ground won't have the capacity to absorb it all. So there is an outflow, there is an overflooding, and as a result of that, flash floods and devastations, they are common. So you have excessive rainfall, excessive rains in a concentrated span. Now, this leads to flash floods. But here, we do not restrict climate change only to this factor. When we say climate change, how the global climate is changing, just understand that. when we talk about one of the important rainfall causing phenomena in northern part of India, it is the western disturbances. And when we talk about western disturbances, these are basically the low pressure systems which are traveling all the way from the region of Mediterranean, where these low pressure systems they develop. They travel all the way from the Mediterranean, end up reaching the northern part of the country, causing snowfall amongst the mountain reaches and also heavy amount of downpour. Now these western disturbances under normal circumstances, they continue from the month of November up till around April under normal conditions. But then this year, even in the month of May, western disturbances have been observed, and more so even up till the month of July. So this year, these western disturbances have continued even for the month of July. Now, what does that mean, or what is the implication of this? So if this low pressure system is traveling, it will bring rainfall. But why is it that when this low pressure system comes in the month of July, it is so very destructive? That is because in the month of July, later part of June and July itself, already the monsoonal low pressure system starts developing over the northern part of the country. So under the present circumstances, what has happened is that these monsoonal low pressure has combined with the western disturbances. So there has been a combination. Monsoonal low pressure. So this has led to a significantly increased rainfall, high amount of rains. Again, this is a result of what? Of nothing but climate change. So that is where climate change is indeed impacting the scenario on the ground. Other than that, you also have the changing land use pattern. And when we say a changing land use pattern, what do we mean by that? So for example, earlier, let's suppose the land was being utilized for, let's say, fruit orchards, or let's say generally the land was under trees and significant amount of green cover, but there has been an increased amount of deforestation, and also rather than fruit orchards you have smaller cash crops which are grown. So due to that increased amount of deforestation, there has been a lack of general water cycle, and the disturbance of water cycle has happened. Why does that happen? So very briefly, if you can think about it, let's suppose in an area, and northeastern states also suffer from this. Let's suppose in an area there is a domination of various amount of trees, or a green cover is significant. Now on a daily basis, these trees will end up supplying some amount of moisture into the atmosphere. That brings a regulated amount of rainfall on a daily or a weekly basis. But imagine a circumstance where you cut down all these trees. Now that supply of moisture, that is completely prevented. So now the rainfall is going to be dependent on the low pressure systems and the monsoonal clouds which are carried. So what does that mean? You will have prolonged dry spell, drought-like conditions, followed by sudden copious amount of rainfall, again followed by dry conditions. So you have the twin problems of floods followed by droughts followed by floods. So that is because of increased rate of deforestation. Then you also have the various hydroelectric projects which are being implemented in the state of Himachal Pradesh, along with the other Himalayan states as well. The amount of hydroelectric projects in terms of the electricity generation capacity and potential, that is increasing exponentially. Now majority of the hydroelectric projects in this region, they are run-of-the-river projects. Run-of-the-river projects means what? So this is an image which helps you understand. So imagine if a river is flowing like this. So rather than constructing a kind of a dam or a kind of a stoppage, some amount of that water or a significant amount of that water is actually diverted. And that water here which is diverted, the sediment, the silt carried by the river is not diverted. The sediment and the silt, that is left back into the mainstream. So After this diversion, the water is carried through the channel and eventually through the penstock, it is used to run the turbines which are associated and attached with the generator, and electricity is generated and eventually they are fed back. Now, as a consequence of this, even though it is considered to be environmentally friendly as compared to construction of large dams, you have to understand that what it has led to is a scenario where now this particular portion has been left with very little amount of water and excessive amount of sediments. So the river channel that you have after that diversion, that river channel has got very less water, right, and excess sediments. Obviously, when you have that kind of very limited amount of water, where the river is basically converted into a kind of a stream or a small nala of sorts, now what will happen? Encroachments happen. People start construction here. They will construct houses, shops, etc., resorts, hotels. Everything is constructed because they are assured that there will not be a major flow of river coming through here. Now, in these conditions, when there is an excessive amount of sudden downpour, obviously, all that water won't be diverted. A significant section will be coming through the main channel, but that main channel is obstructed, isn't it? If you can imagine the main river channel like this, so it is filled with those sediments and debris, construction debris, etc. So the amount or the volume available for the flow of water is absolutely limited. So immediately it will lead to what? Floods. So that is something which has also been a cause. Ever since the past decade and so on, the number of these projects being implemented in the Himalayan region have been on the rise. And there have not been significant amount of geological surveys which have been done, due to which these river courses have also been impacted. And then there is the ever prevalent issue of rampant and unsustainable infrastructure construction. Due to a boom in tourism and the tourism sector in general, there has been a rampant development of roads, development of various different infrastructure facilities, etc. Now here also you have to understand that when you talk about a hilly area, let's suppose, now in that hilly area, if you have to construct a road, you cannot simply vertically cut down the mountain like this and construct a road. In this situation, what will happen is that this road and this entire region will always be prone to slippage. In the case of excessive rainfall, there will be a mass movement and everything will be slipping down. All of that will drain where? Into the river channel, which is draining here. Look at the river channel. So when all these materials, they will get deposited into the river channel, what will happen to the level of water? It will increase, it will cause flooding. So rather than that vertical cut, there is a need to have a terrace cut development. And for that, you need to carry out proper environmental impact assessment. And for that, you need proper geological surveys. And that is one of the major impediments here. So that is why it will be apt to say or basically interpret that Himalayan disaster or the Himachal disaster as a kind of a man-made disaster which has been exaggerated by the climate change. Okay? Now, after this, we come to another topic and another article, and that is a basic touching of the concept where you have to be exposed to this particular basic concept of what do we mean by full reserve banking. So the article basically is relevant again for your prelims as well, because in prelims also you can get a question that what do you understand, or a statement based question that which of these exhibits a full reserve banking, as well as in your GS paper 3. Now, this is full reserve banking where banks act solely as custodians of the customer's money. So what is the meaning of full reserve banking? And what is the meaning of the fractional reserve banking? Let us understand that in a bit of a detail. So when we talk about a full reserve banking, it basically is a condition where the banks, they only lend money based upon the time deposits. I hope you would have studied in the portion of economy that when you talk about the deposits carried out by the banks, now these deposits can be classified into demand deposits demand deposits and as well as time deposits. Now, what is the meaning of each of them? Demand deposits, whenever you require, you can withdraw that money. For example, you have the savings account, isn't it? And then time deposit, which has got a maturity period, where you can withdraw money only after that maturity period has basically lapsed. So that is, for example, let's suppose fixed deposit, right? Now, generally what happens is that in the banks, under the prevalent circumstances, what happens is that we put our money in savings bank account and we withdraw it at a time of our own utility and our own ease. Now the banks, they are keeping that money, and based on the money that they are keeping, they also lend some other customers some money, maybe for expansion of businesses, for other purposes. Now banks, they don't end up earning from the deposits, because in the case of the deposits, the banks have to pay you some interest. 3 to 4% of interest rate is provided on the savings account, isn't it? So the banks will never be earning through these deposits. How is it that the banks earn? They earn through lending. So when they loan you out some money, that is the source of income from the banks, because that is where they earn interest. So what the banks generally do is that based upon certain amount of deposits that you have, they will end up lending to large number of customers. Now, that basically brings its own set of problems. How? Let's suppose I have a bank. Let's suppose we consider any of the banks. Let's suppose Yes Bank. Now, in Yes Bank, 5 people, A, B, C, D and E, they have deposited, let's suppose 1 lakh each. And it is their deposit in the case of demand deposit. Now this Yes Bank, based upon those sets of deposits, it has lent out to 50 customers. 1, 2, all the way till 50. To each one of them, it has basically lent out close to around 50,000, 1 lakh, something to that amount, so that the bank can earn. Now imagine if the economic scenario actually goes belly up. Now all these depositors, A to E, they will immediately go to the bank and they will ask for the money back. But the bank has not got that money because bank has given that money to someone else. So that is where their deposits are at risk. So this is the prevalent circumstances, the present circumstance. That is where the concept of full reserve banking comes into the picture. So the definition aspect, again, for your answer writing. So when we talk about the full reserve banking, what is it? It is a system of banking where the banks are not allowed to lend out money that they receive as demand deposits. In fact, from those demand deposits, the banks are supposed to keep your deposits safely, and for that you are supposed to pay the bank some amount that, okay, keep my money safe. I will give you 5% interest on that. So that is the case. And the lending, when is it that the banks will lend in that case? The banks will be lending only when someone carries out a time deposit. That is the FD, etc. So only in the case of time deposits, from that money the banks will carry out the lending purposes. So that is where it will ensure that the depositor money is always safe, and it provides for a significant cushion. But then this is rarely followed, and this is in fact not at all followed. And what we follow is a fractional reserve banking. And what is that? Where you lend out based upon some amount of deposit, because nowadays anyways cash usage has come down. Even when you have to make payments, rarely do you go to the bank and withdraw large piles of cash. You ensure electronic payments, isn't it? So when the cash payment has come down, the requirement of physical cash has also reduced in this banking sector. As a consequence, the banks end up lending significantly. While it has got certain set of risk factor associated with it, but then you have to understand that nowadays, as we saw in the case of Yes Bank and other banks across the globe as well, whenever the situation turns dire, immediately the central banks, they step in and they come in to help, right? They provide some amount of liquidity for the banks to emerge out of that scenario. Now also, Here, first factor is that central banks, that is the Reserve Bank in India, the Federal Reserve in the case of United States and so on. So central banks come to the rescue, right? Now, other than that, when you have increased lending, while it has got a possibility of, let's say, a non-performing asset being created if due diligence is not carried out, this increased lending also has got a scope to expand the economy. Because let's say I borrow some money. I borrow some money to open up my own business. And thereby, when I will open up my own business, not only will I create employment, but there I will also be augmenting the demand. And that is something where the banks will eventually benefit. How? So if A has borrowed money, let's suppose from the bank, right? Now A is running a business whereby it has provided employment to B, C, D and E, let's suppose. Now B, C, D and E, they are earning some income. Where will they deposit that income? In the banks. So eventually the banks will profit from that. So that is why it will lead to an expansion of the economy. Right? Even though the risk factor is there, and that is why you need to carry out proper due diligence before lending anything. So this is a factor of full reserve banking and fractional reserve banking that you should be aware of. Very briefly, I will tell you again, full reserve banking, you do not lend out any amount of cash that you receive by demand deposit, because demand deposit can be basically withdrawn by the customers at any point of time. So you do not lend out based upon that money. That money is safe. Then few of the customers will give you time-based deposits, and there from that chunk you provide the lending to ensure safety and security of the depositors. But in that case, the proper functioning of the banking system in terms of the help it provides to the economy, that will be limited. Okay, I hope that is understood. Now coming to a couple of articles relevant for your prelims. So Lok Sabha has passed the Biological Diversity Bill amendment. Now this Biodiversity Amendment, Biodiversity Act was passed when? In 2002. Okay, that is something you need to be aware of. Now why was it passed in 2002? In order to adhere to the demands of the Convention to Biological Diversity. So here, as per the demands of Convention on Biological Diversity. And when did this convention come into place? In 1992 Rio Summit. Now, this Biodiversity Act 2002 basically had certain objectives. What were the objectives? Conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of biodiversity, and also fair and equitable access and benefit sharing with the local population and the local people. And also, for any kind of knowledge sharing which you needed to carry out, you needed to get an approval from the Biodiversity Board, the State Biodiversity Board, the National Biodiversity Authority, as well as the Biodiversity Management Committees which are present at the district level. Now, as per this new amendment which has been passed, there has been a kind of a decriminalization in many of the offences. So many of the offences which were penalizable by a jail term, they have been reduced to a kind of a financial penalty. And also, it was found out, and it was basically observed for a long time, that the Ayush practitioners, that is the Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, naturopathy practitioners that you have in India, they could not be using many traditional knowledge and many of the traditional information that they had available to them because of the stringent methods of getting an approval from the State Biodiversity Authority. So that is why what this act has done is it has exempted the users of codified traditional knowledge. That is the traditional knowledge which has been available, and that traditional knowledge can be used and utilized by the Ayush practitioners without the requirement of getting an approval or a provision of approval for access or sharing of benefits from the Biodiversity Authority. So it has been relaxed a bit. Also, as per this amendment, there has been decriminalization in the case of many penalties. So there have been pros and cons which have been highlighted as per this amendment. There have been a lot of criticisms which have also been met out because it basically amounts to dilution of this particular act, dilution of the norms and reduction of penalties, and also it in a way also provides a kind of a way whereby the people don't have to share the benefits with the local population. So the local population will be harmed in the long run, which is going to contravene or contradict the aspects of the Nagoya Protocol for the CBD. So that is something which is relevant for your prelims. Then the final orbit raising maneuver of Chandrayaan 3 has been completed. Now that orbit raising maneuver, here, what do we mean by that? So when you talk about the Chandrayaan 3 mission in general, so let's suppose we consider this as the planet Earth. So Chandrayaan 3, when it is launched and has been launched, it has been carrying out the orbit raising maneuvers, where the perigee is the point closest to the planet Earth. Perigee is remaining the same. The apogee, that is the point farthest from the planet in the orbit, that has been increased. So how is it done? So at the time when the spacecraft comes at the region of the perigee, a boost is provided, a speed boost is provided, rocket engine is fired. So with that increased speed, it reaches a greater distance, comes back, again a boost is provided. So as per the latest orbit raising maneuver, this apogee has been increased to 1,27,000 kilometers, whereas the perigee is close to around 236 kilometers. Now eventually after this, on 1st of August, eventually there will be the translunar injection, where this spacecraft having enough amount of speed will then be injected into the orbit of the moon. Okay, and then slowly and steadily its speed will be decreased at again the region of the perigee, whereby it will eventually come closer to the moon to make a softer landing. And already you would be aware of the various different aspects of Chandrayaan 3, that it has got a kind of a lander module, a propulsion module, as well as a rover which has been included, and the life of the rover is going to be 1 lunar day, that is close to around 14 days on planet Earth. So that is basically the articles which have appeared in the newspaper for today, which are relevant for your examination. So let us take a look at the questions which can be derived from this. So first is, the hill states are becoming more prone to natural disasters, influenced both by man and nature. Discuss. So here, first of all, understand the statement. The statement is about the hill states. Now here you can highlight the fact that how even the IPCC 6th assessment report highlights that it is the hilly states and the coastal states of the country which are going to be impacted significantly by climate change. So here in the introduction part, very briefly talk about that how these hill states are experiencing increased amount of the sporadic rainfall, landslides, flash floods, and natural disasters are on the rise. That will be your brief introduction. Then in the body part, maybe by a rough map of the country, you can highlight the aspects of climate change as well. Always advisable that when you are drawing a map or any image, immediately do it after the introduction, so that it gives the evaluator an idea of what you are going to represent. So in that, talk about how it can bring about, or climate change is bringing about those disturbances. Then talk about the other relevant factors as well. And because it is of 250 words, spend some time in the final portion of the body where you talk about the way forward, where what can be done, sustainability of development, proper geological inspection, proper environmental impact assessment, the very generic factors. Right? With that you end the body, and conclusion should always in a way be futuristic in a manner. So, or also taking an overall summary. So you can write in the conclusion that year after year the damages and losses which are incurred are simply intolerable. So the need of the hour is to develop a proper standard operating procedure as far as these hill states and Himalayan region is concerned, in order to bring about an equitable and as well as a sustainable development for the long-term future, which can mitigate the impact of climate change. Okay, and that will fetch you good amount of marks. Then, what is meant by circular economy? Discuss the role played by India in order to minimize the waste generated in the economic setup. So this is a 10 mark and a 150 worded answer. So here the framing will be slightly different. Your introduction will be restricted to around 20 words at max, 20 to 25 words. Now here in the introduction, what do you address? You simply address what do you mean by circular economy. The main question is to be addressed. And then after that, so here you also can draw that schematic triangle of reduce, reuse and recycle. You can draw that. And then you can talk about the facets of circular economy very briefly in the body, that how it benefits the creation of demand, the generation of employment in the economic setup, and then eventually talk about the various government schemes which have been inculcated, the aspect of the 4 principles that India is following as the chair of G20, and then conclude that how the circular economy is the need of the hour and the requirement for the development in a sustainable manner for the future generation without depriving anyone of the resource requirement for today. Okay? Yes, you can also use the government scrappage policy as well. So that will be all from my side. Till we meet again tomorrow. Take care of yourself, and I would actually suggest and recommend everyone that go to our Telegram page and our Telegram channel, take up the multiple choice questions, assess your level of understanding for these topics, and I hope the session has been meaningful and helpful to all of you. If you like the session, please click on the like, share and the subscribe button, and till we meet again tomorrow, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.